Forum. Thank you for showing up. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Stephen Rosen. He is the Benton Michael Caneb Professor of National Security and Military Affairs at Harvard University. He also is the author of Winning the Next War, which I had to review this weekend before my podcast as some light beach reading. So we're excited to have him here talk about innovation and how he sort of views the way that the Army factors into the world of today. So without further ado,
Great.
Dr. Rosen.
Thank you, Major. Thank you all for taking the time to come and speak to me. And thank you to Captain Obang for inviting me to come speak. I was delighted to come here because my view is that people in the United States national security community are prematurely giving up or rejecting the role of ground force combat in American world affairs on the basis of recent experience, and this is a premature and incorrect conclusion. But it is very difficult to think about the future of ground warfare and ground combat, and to the extent that I can be engaging people like you in conversations about where is the future of war going and what relevance does it have for ground warfare. This is something which will be to my benefit. I will learn something from this, so I thank you for taking the time to interact with me. The general issue that I work on is the character of war and what will be the changes that are taking place that may require the United States military establishment to change to some extent or to a large extent the way it does business. As you all know from just looking out the window, the record of experts in predicting who the United States will fight in combat is 100%. It's 100% wrong. We did not predict we would fight in Korea. We did not predict we would fight in Vietnam. We did not predict we would fight in Iraq or Afghanistan. So when thinking about the future of war, it seems to me to be a bad idea to try to predict whom we will fight, but more useful to think about how we will fight. People, in fact, have been modestly successful in thinking about the general framework and character of the kind of conflict in which the United States will be engaged in the future. People did think about and to some extent foresee what we now call the revolution in military affairs, the RMA, the application of information warfare to technology. Earlier on, people did see the rise of counterinsurgency, although people didn't recommend that we engage in it or not, but the fact of insurgency as a major form of warfare was understood. And people in the interwar period did see the rise of combined arms warfare. So what I would like to concentrate on is the changes in the character of war, which we can foresee on the basis of facts, not speculation. In particular, on the basis of what we can observe about the diffusion of technology, the spread of technology around the world. Predicting the invention of new things is impossible, almost by definition. Something that has never existed before could exist, but how would you know when it is coming or what it would look like? The diffusion of technology, the spread of things that already exist from more technologically advanced countries to less technologically advanced countries, is a matter of observation, which depends on spread of people who have certain kinds of educational backgrounds, the spending of money on certain kinds of engineering infrastructure. It is like demographics, population demographics, modestly predictable. You can observe what's going on, you can see the trends, and you can make some predictions about it. What I would like to do is link up what we can see empirically, factually, about the diffusion of technology and link it to the change in the character of how we would have to fight and the ways in which it may be relevant to the American military establishment. Here's the argument. The United States military for almost all the 20th century and into the 21st century has basically been in the business of intercontinental power projection. We fight away games. We fight far from the United States. That means moving militarily significant amounts of men and material thousands of miles across oceans. We fight on the periphery of Eurasia. Every place we fought is on the periphery of Eurasia. Here's the argument. The diffusion of information-based military technologies is going to make that kind of power projection, as it is currently conducted, prohibitively expensive. The United States, therefore, is going to have to think about getting out of the power projection business or finding new ways of conducting power projection. The spread of information technologies, which is taking place, has taken place, which we can observe, is giving advantages to local defense relative to long-distance power projection forces, such that the cost of long-distance power projection against local forces armed with information technology-supported weapons will become prohibitively expensive. Okay? I will argue that this is a change, that the power projection that we saw taking place in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, which is associated with imperialism, was caused by the revolutions in military affairs that took place in the 17th century and the 19th century, which gave professionally organized military organizations massive advantage relative to local disorganized forces, and the matter of transportation in revolutions, railroads and so forth, which gave people the ability to conduct operations at long distances. That revolution made possible the increase in power projection capabilities. The latest revolutions in military affairs and their diffusion, I'll bring them to an end. On my reading, this will cause a change in the character of the American Army, about as large as the change in its character when it went from being a 19th century garrison army on the American frontier to being a Eurasian military player. In other words, it may be a big deal. Okay. What's the argument? Well, the background is historical. A lot of this discussion is based on the concept of revolutions in military affairs, which is familiar to us because we all observe the impact of precision, guided munitions, and so forth. The historical context is not so widely appreciated. The revolution in military affairs that took place in the 17th century that was associated with Maurice of Nassau and Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden is well known. Before that revolution, European armies were large mass armies of poorly trained, poorly organized peasants. These soldiers were not disciplined. They were pushed forward in large formations and engaged in basically uncoordinated single combat. This was the form of warfare that was dominant in Europe at that time, but it was also dominant in China and India. The 17th century revolution in military affairs reintroduced Roman legionary discipline and maneuver on the battlefield so that defensive pikemen and musketeers could present interlocked groups of soldiers whose lines could not be broken by uncoordinated infantry assaults or by cavalry charges. These interlocked groups of soldiers could maneuver on the battlefield while not breaking formation to advance and shift directions. The power of this revolution was to increase the military power of units employing these methods by an order of magnitude, by a factor of 10, such that in fact we saw Dutch military units with this form of organization defeating Spanish imperial forces 10 times their size. We saw British and French armies using this form of organization fighting against India, defeating Mughal Indian armies 10 times their size. Again, this is one of the factors that permits power projection. Once this revolution was demonstrated and visible in Europe, the use of Latin as a common language in the educated class made the circulation of the basic Roman documents, Vegetius and so forth, that laid out these methods, made it available to all the military leaders of Europe. And so this technology diffused over a period of about 100 years within Europe, and within about 100 years more diffused to Asia, to the rest of Asia. Okay. This much is fairly well known. What is less widely discussed, but which is discussed by David Kaiser in his book, The Politics of War, is that this revolution also revolutionized power projection. Before the professionalization of armies, when armies were groups of mass peasants, there was very little point in sending your army a long distance to fight a battle alongside your allies. That group of soldiers, undisciplined peasants, could not be sent long distances because they would run away to loot and get food on the way to their destination because there were no professional logisticians or supply chains to keep them supplies, because they were poorly disciplined and would engage in behavior to benefit themselves, looting. And there was no point to sending these armies, mass armies, long distances, because it was more efficient simply to send money. If you sent money to your allies, they could recruit local peasants and put them in armies because their peasants were about as well or as badly trained as your peasants. moving money was easier and more efficient rather than moving people. So power projection took the form of monetary subsidies and propaganda and other techniques to mobilize local audiences. The Spanish Armada, maybe the most famous power projection effort, 1588 and all that, was designed mostly to support English Catholics fighting against English Protestants, not to actually play a decisive role in the battle. Once you had professional armies, power projection in the form of sending trained armies out made sense, because relatively small numbers of well-organized, well-trained soldiers could be sent longer distances and could have a decisive impact on the local battles because they were so much more effective relative to the locals. Power projections shifted away from sending money to sending professional armies, first done by ships, because sea transport was the easiest and most efficient way to move people. The revolution in military affairs in the 19th century associated with the introduction of rifled infantry weapons and railroads transformed power projection on land, because you could now move tens of thousands of soldiers 1,500 or more miles within a period of a week. In the American Civil War, before the Battle of Chickamauga, we see Union forces being moved 1,200 miles by rail. You could not do this before. Long-distance power projection on land is made possible by the 19th century military revolution of railroads and rifles. If both sides of a conflict, however, had gained access to this revolution in military affairs, that is, if both sides had professionally organized armies, if both sides used railroads, and both sides had rifled infantry weapons, the result was a stalemate, as we saw in the later phases of the American Civil War, and as we easily saw in World War I, which limits the effectiveness of power projection. Asymmetric capabilities relevant to these military revolutions supports and enables power projection, sending small numbers of people long distances to fight battles with decisive impact long distances. When both sides get this access to the revolutions, the advantage is neutralized, power projection becomes much more difficult. The digital information revolution in military affairs was initially asymmetric. The United States had it, other countries did not, and it facilitated American power projection, most obviously in the first Gulf War, where the United States enjoyed a lopsided victory. But the diffusion of digital information technology has given precision strike capabilities, reconnaissance strike capabilities, to use the Soviet term, to people around the world, both states and non-state actors. This is making and will make power projection much more difficult. Before digital information technology was widely introduced into military sensors, communication systems, and data processing systems, effective attack on the industrial and mobilization base of power projection forces and effective attacks on their long lines of communications were difficult. Bombers could go long distances, but they were inaccurate and did very little damage to industrial and railroad transportation systems and took heavy losses until air forces had complete air superiority and massive numbers of bombers to compensate for their inaccuracy. Those conditions were satisfied by the British and American air forces only by mid-1944 in Europe and against Germany, and by 1945 against Japan. There was one precision strike capability available to attack long lines of communications, and it almost defeated the Allies in World War II. This, of course, is the manned submarine, which could maneuver itself, guide itself by analog means towards a target to destroy it, which almost cost the Allies the Battle of the Atlantic. That same submarine technology applied by the United States against Japan sunk the entire Japanese merchant marine fleet. By the summer of 1945, there are no Japanese merchant ships larger than 500 tons operating in the Pacific. Digital information technology, however, using silicon and wireless communications, makes possible the reliable collection of information, the processing of that data about enemy target systems. That enables you to find targets and to target them, and if you can target them, you can destroy them. Let me emphasize the point about reliability, a point made clear by the research of Barry Watts. Precision strike weapons are not new. The first precision strike weapons against ships were used by the Germans in 1944. The United States used thousands of precision strike weapons in the Vietnam War. Those weapons, however, were based on vacuum tube technology and had reliability rates. The percentage of systems in the field that would actually function as designed, they had reliability rates in the high single digits. It is silicon technology, solid states, integrated circuits that made these systems, using digital information for data processing, reliable. This made it possible to conduct strikes against fixed targets at hundreds of thousands of miles with high accuracy and high reliability. Basically, we now live in an era where targets that are fixed or with limited mobility, that are not defended or not hidden, are dead. We are used to this with regard to American capabilities against enemy systems. What may be coming to pass is the reverse as well. In addition to precision strike, made possible by digital information technology, information warfare conducted against digital systems, usually known as cyber warfare, can conduct disruptive attacks on targets linked to the internet at essentially unlimited distances. The argument that I'm going to make is that this diffusion of technology gives advantages to local defenses relative to conventional power projection forces. Why? Local defenses, by definition, employ shorter range systems, physically smaller precision strike systems, and because they are smaller, they are easier to hide in complex urban environments or in other forms of complex terrain. They can be put underground more easily. They can maneuver more easily. They can be more easily defended. Because they depend on line-of-sight communications, they are harder to disrupt by electronic warfare. Other things, and they can be based on ground. Local defenses can be based on the ground. Other things equal, it is easier to conceal a military system on land relative to in the air or in the ocean. It's easier to hide things on land than it is to hide them in the air or in the ocean. It's easier to be stealthy on land than it is on. If you want to have a stealthy bomber, you have to have basically you have to have $1 trillion program to develop the technology. But if you want to be stealthy on land, you use terrain and you go underground. In Afghanistan, adversaries use mud to conceal themselves from U.S. sensor systems. It's easier to hide on land than it is in the air, on the surface of the ocean, and probably easier to hide on land than it is to hide underwater. Local defenses are, by definition, land-based systems. Long-range power projection systems are going to have to operate from air-based platforms or sea-based platforms against land-based systems. The defender will have an easier time finding the guys coming across the ocean to come kill them, and the guys coming across the ocean to come kill them will have a hard time finding them if they're concealed, defended, dispersed, and hardened on land. Land-based local defenses will have advantages over power projection forces. Think Hezbollah missiles in Lebanon. Think of how hard it is to find them and destroy them. Conventional power projection forces must use large transportation systems. Why large? They're coming a long way. They need a lot of fuel. They need a lot of food to feed the people on the ships. Those large transportation systems that get you to the theater are hard to hide when they get to their destination. Why? They have to proceed to fixed ports and airfields. Once they get in theater, they have less intra-theater mobility, because intra-theater mobility assets are also big and need a lot of fuel and are hard to hide. So the forces doing the power projection will be easy to target on their way there, easy to target once they are there, relative to their ability to find and target the local forces. The local forces will have use of mobility, concealment, active defense, and hardening to leverage their advantages. On top of this, cyber attack, so-called, can disrupt civilian transportation systems that support power projection. They can disrupt air control systems. They can disrupt port monitoring and coordination activities. Why do we have reason to worry about this? People's Liberation Army of China manuals starting from 2002 talk about how to defeat American power projection, and they say the big mistake that the Argentines made in their war against the British in the Falkland Islands is they waited to defend the Falkland Islands until the British got to the Falkland Islands. They should have disrupted the supply chain that began in the United Kingdom. By the way, you don't need only cyber warfare to do that. Unconventional warfare methods for disrupting soft civilian infrastructure that supports power projection is all too easy to imagine. This is not conjectural. The availability of reconnaissance, strike, digital information systems in the hands of Hezbollah is well documented. The Iranian government has tested precision strike intermediate range ballistic missiles with accuracies of 3 meters. These technologies are in the hands of smaller and medium states, and they are in the hands of non-state actors. Power projection will have to be conducted against them. So what is to be done? If you buy my argument, or parts of it, the United States must make some choices. It can give up the business, it can get out of the business of intercontinental power projection, take advantage of the new capabilities to help our allies defend themselves. If local defense gets easier, diffusing or accelerating the diffusion of technology to our Japanese allies, our South Korean allies, to our Israeli, not allies, but sometimes partners elsewhere, should enable them to defend against large forces attempting to project power against them. The United States will get out of the business of going overseas to defend allies and get more into the business of enabling our allies to defend themselves. That's one possible response. The second is to give up the business of power projection and our allies and undertake the business of the defense of the homeland of the United States and perhaps the Western Hemisphere. Again, go, as Sun Tzu would say, go with the tendency of things. Align yourself with the propensity of things and do what's most easy to do, which is defend yourself. A strong continental or strong hemispheric defense will be relatively straightforward. The third choice is to think about doing power projection in a different way. If moving large forces overseas by large ships is likely to be very difficult, as it will be, how might it be done differently? First option, stop thinking about forward deployment to a conflict and emphasize forward basing or foreign emplacements in peacetime. In peacetime, as the Chinese have shown us, you can do lots of things to build up forces and build up installations that you would not be able to do in wartime. They're doing this in the South China Sea area. But you will have to do this in ways that are concealed, hardened, underground, and defended. If you put American forces in peacetime overseas in forward locations, then they're not so dispersed, hardened, hidden, and defended. They will be destroyed in the opening salvos of the war. And the question will be, will American allies want to pay the price that would enable the United States to do this? This is an open question, not entirely up to us. Second thing, you can make American power projection forces harder to target in transit and in theater by making them harder to detect. The normal American response is technology. We'll have cloaks of invisibility or something like that, which is probably not adequate or not appropriate. We should think about doing it the way other countries have successfully done it. Make your power projection forces hard to detect by making them ambiguous, by making them hard not to detect, but hard to identify and characterize. Russian little green men were not undetected. It just wasn't clear what they were, and therefore a full military response against them was harder to justify. During the current war in Iraq, the American Air Force utilized tactical intelligence collection aircraft that were based on business jets and looked like business jets. They could fly to any airport in the world and nobody would know because they looked like just another business jet landing. You can employ people's war methodologies for power projection. you can make military systems look like civilian systems and therefore harder to discriminate from the background noise. By the way, the Germans did this in World War II in their campaign against Norway. They used merchant ships that looked like merchant ships to transport military cargoes. Okay? So we should think about ambiguous or deniable military forces. We should, fourth or third, we should think about concepts of operation that make use of mobility, dispersal, and complex terrain to limit the ability of adversaries to target them once they are in theater. This probably means relying on smaller units, which other things equal will have less firepower. So ways in which to redress that imbalance, the lack of firepower in the deployed forces, will have to be addressed. It could be a combination of light, small, very mobile local forces that are introduced into theater, supported by very long-range precision strike systems operating at a distance. To do that, to reduce time of flight, to reduce the flash-to-bang times, you probably need hypersonics. You keep out of range and out of theater the heavier systems that provide the fire support. However, though I mentioned technology, I would avoid looking for technological silver bullets. The idea that you can find some super technology that will make small forces have infinite firepower and be infinitely mobile and have zero energy and ammunition requirements. Sometimes people talk about directed energy weapons like they would have these characteristics. They would have infinite magazines. They'd never run out of bullets, and somehow or another they wouldn't need to be refueled. That probably won't be the case. We should think about a combination of operational measures in addition to technological measures. Now, the spread of digital information technology is not the only thing that's going on in the world. The other major trend in terms of diffusion of technology is the diffusion of nuclear weapons technology, which clearly has gone on, and in my view will continue if the United States does not denuclearize North Korea, which on current odds it looks like it will not. If nuclear weapons become more extensively proliferated, the functional requirements generated by the diffusion of precision strike capabilities probably will be reinforced. What is the response to the presence of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield? The same as it is to conventional precision strike weapons. You disperse, you go underground, you harden, and you conceal. So the diffusion of nuclear weapons, to the extent that it occurs, reinforces the functional requirements that the diffusion of precision strike weapons already imposes on us. Every prediction should say why it will be wrong, if it is going to be wrong. What could invalidate my forecast? It could occur that things could happen which would make precision strike capabilities based on information technologies unusable. And it is possible to imagine the conditions under which this would happen. Electromagnetic pulse weapons will fry the brains of any unhardened precision strike system that we deploy. It is not prohibitively expensive to harden these systems against the EMP, but you do have to spend some money. Those systems can't be pumped by nuclear weapons. They can be pumped by non-nuclear sources of power. Both will do the job reasonably well. Cyber attacks also could bring down all of the information systems on which we currently rely. So it is not inconceivable that the spread of information-based precision strike technologies will be neutralized by counter technologies. In that case, we are back in a world which looks something like 1920. And on a first examination, power projection in a world of 1920 does not look all that easy. Why? What is information technology enable you to do? It enables you to use your weapons more accurately. Because you can use them more accurately, you don't need as many of them. Because you don't need as many of them, you don't have to carry as many of them. Because you don't have to carry as many of them, you don't need as much fuel to supply the things that carry them. Power projection gets much heavier without modern information technology. It becomes a question of mass, which is not easy. To conclude, as I began, we have not had a good record of predicting where we would fight, but some military organizations have from time to time done a good job of thinking about how they would fight. So our job is to learn from the organizations that did that job well and ask whether or not we could do some things similar to what they did to improve our ability to think about the future. What did successful organizations do in the past? The United States Navy went from being a battleship Navy to an aircraft carrier Navy when aviation was introduced. They thought about the character of warfare after aviation. How did they do it? It was a partnership between the Naval War College, which did the simulation and analytical work, working within Fleet and the Bureau of Aeronautics. In other words, it was a partnership between a research and analysis unit dedicated to the task of thinking about the future, of concepts of operations for the future, with operational military units that would actually try to employ them. In other words, it was not simply an academic research and analysis effort. Real-world operators were closely integrated and participated. The Marine Corps did the same thing with amphibious warfare. They created an analytical institution, the School of Amphibious Warfare, in 1921, and they created an operational unit to utilize, test out, and develop their concepts in the Fleet Marine Force in 1934. When the United States Air Force had to think about the problem of intercontinental strategic nuclear warfare, it created both the RAND Corporation, which included analysts, mathematicians, weapons designers, and Air Force officers, and the Strategic Air Command to think about the operational aspects. In other words, when faced with major shifts in the character of warfare and the need to think about how to react to them, new, single-purpose, dedicated organizations with a sole mission of figuring out the character of new modes of warfare were created, and they took the form of partnerships of academic institutions along with operational military organizations. That included science and technology people as operators. The process in all the cases of working out the character of the new mode of warfare, translating it into operational practice, testing it out, and then fielding it took some 10 to 15 years. So that is why I am here. I will be retired or dead before this gets worked out. You are the people who will have to be involved in this effort. You will have to find ways or work with people in the analytical side of the house and the operational side of the house to think out, whether I'm right or wrong, what are the ways in which we can empirically demonstrate that the character of war is changing? How does that affect our ability to execute our national level missions? And what are the concepts of operations that we can develop that are appropriate to and would be successful under those conditions that are projected into the future? If some number of you are motivated to work more on this in the rest of your military careers, I'll be a happy man. But right now, I'm here to take your criticisms and your comments so that we can develop our ideas further. Thank you very much.
Hey, so we have some time for a question and answer. I would ask if you're going to ask a question, let me run the mic over to you so we can get your question on the camera. So does anyone have any questions for Dr. Rosen?
Sir, Cadet Pierce, class of 2018, how do you think the autonomous weapon revolution in warfare will affect the power projection equation, specifically the drone swarms that could number in the hundreds of thousands? Wouldn't it be easier for the United States to employ these weapons and significantly increase our power projection capabilities?
Yes, it will be a factor, but I don't think it will fundamentally change the picture that I sketched out. Why? The autonomous drones deployed in swarms, that is to say in dozens or hundreds of numbers, are small. Right? That's how you can make a swarm. They don't have the range to get from the United States to the periphery of Eurasia on their own power. They will have ranges measured in hundreds of yards, not hundreds of miles, which means some other system is going to have to bring them across the Atlantic or wherever, and that system is going to have to take a lot of them, and therefore that system that transports the drones, that will form the swarms will be subject to the same problems that I mentioned before. How will it get across the Atlantic or the Pacific in large enough numbers to affect the balance of power without not the drones themselves being visible and vulnerable, but without the transport systems? What are the Chinese doing now? Why are they building the J-20? They want to shoot down the air-to-air refueling tankers that enable us to get across the Pacific. A B-2 flies from continental United States to Asia. It is refueled by tankers out of Guam. Okay? Suppose that B-2 was a stealthy air transport full of drones that would form a swarm. It still has to be refueled. It's still big. It's still thirsty. So you may reduce the size and tonnage of the payloads that you need to deploy by removing the man from the element, but you do not remove the requirement for the transport of large amounts of stuff in systems that are inherently easier to detect than the stuff which is shooting them down. Okay? This, however, is a matter for empirical investigation. I am told, I'm delighted to find that the people here are in touch with DARPA and other places. People are working on drones. They say, okay, just how many of these things do you fit in what kind of system? How stealthy can you make a stealthy 747? People are working. How much does that sucker cost? Okay. Then you can, the people taking philosophy, say, what are the ethics of deploying autonomous weapons tens of thousands of miles from the United States? Is it something we're comfortable with? Remember, all of these smart autonomous systems will be learning systems because the adversary will be rapidly trying to adjust his defenses to find them better and shoot them down better or defeat them otherwise. That means all the drones and stuff we're building now rapidly adapt to the behavior they detect from the adversary, which means they're learning on their own, which means we're not sure where they will go. Are we okay with that? Can we build checks against that? Can we limit that? So the point you make is very important and very interesting, but doesn't seem to be an easy or simple pathway to where we want to be. But I do think it's very much worth taking into consideration. Other questions?
Sir, Cadet Tobin, Company A2. You recommend making U.S. power projection vehicles more ambiguous. Would this not force an enemy to target indiscriminately? And do we not have a moral obligation to avoid creating a situation in which civilian safety is sacrificed for military convenience?
Yes, we would have to break most of the known laws of war to do this. It is against the laws of war to take off a military uniform and put on some overalls, right? Military forces are supposed to be identifiable as military forces, so the laws of war can be applied to them. So we know who owns them. We know who is responsible for them. The recommendation I make breaks the laws of war. Whether or not it breaks moral or ethical laws, it is a more complicated argument because we can have disagreements about what is the standard by which we judge the morality. If you employ things that are illegal by international law, but you save large civilian populations from attack by predators, is that moral or is it immoral? Does the means justify the end? Under what conditions? Do some means justify some ends? That's a very complicated argument. But you're right, it will mean a very sharp break from past practice. Does that mean it's out of the question? Not necessarily. Why did the United States get into World War I? Because German submarines were sinking without warning Allied civilian merchant ships. It was against American law for submarines to sink without warning unarmed Allied enemy merchant ships until December 7th, 1941. And then on December 8th, 1941, the American Navy was ordered to go out, find and sink every single Japanese merchant ship it could find without warning. So I'm not prejudging whether or not this is something we should or should not do. You are correct in pointing out it will violate many legal and conventional constraints on the forces. It's not a sufficient argument to say, well, other people have done it, but other people have done it, including us. Okay.
Sir Cadet Berardino. So you said that this diffusion of technology will make power projection for countries like the United States that are oceans away exceedingly difficult. How does it affect the power projection capabilities of, say, like a neighboring country, like Russia to Ukraine, for instance?
There, the argument is if the diffusion has occurred equally on both sides, a stalemate will occur. If the Ukrainian people have better information-based precision strike technologies, short-range military operations on land conducted by Russians against Ukraine or Russian forces backed by the Russians should become more difficult. In other words, a stalemate should occur. This will favor the defense of the status quo. If you think what the Russians are doing is bad and should be stopped, this is an argument for diffusing increased numbers and quality of modern information-based technology military systems to the people we want to help defend themselves. This is a corollary to my point being the strategy of the United States may be better to equip its allies so that they can conduct local defense. Short-range power projection over land areas does not takes advantage of the same advantages that short-range defenses do. Therefore, it should be an equal balance given equal numbers, so there should be some kind of stalemate. Given the fact that generally the United States supports the status quo, this is not necessarily a bad thing from our point of view. It is subject to moral objections. It'll make the battle more deadly. More of the local population will die. The war will be more intense. It'll go on longer. Stalemate or protracted wars tend to be very unpleasant wars. So the people there won't be happy people. So really the choice really is up to them. Do they request these things? Are they aware of this? And do they still want to go ahead and do it? Okay? Other questions?
Can you say something about doctrine? You talked a lot about technology, but how do you see Army doctrine catching up to this power projection, all the costs and benefits that you mentioned?
Information will have to become as large a part in Army doctrine as maneuver and firepower. I mean, that's the short way of putting it. If you can kill what you can find, the name of the game becomes not being findable. So shaping the adversary's knowledge of your location and movements and your character becomes critical. Once he knows that, once he knows where you are, he can kill you. Right now, especially after the experience of the last 20 years, operating against adversaries who don't have anything like our reconnaissance strike capabilities, we are suffering from atrophy of doctrinal development relative to peer competitors. I'm not the first person to point this out, but the particular way in which it affects this argument is that it means we'll have to start doing what the Chinese have been doing for the last 15 to 20 years, conducting operations under conditions of electromagnetic denied information systems. Nothing on our side that uses ones and zeros works in a way that we can put trust in. They'll work. The screens will light up, stuff will, but we won't be sure whether the stuff that's portrayed on them is correct or not. Things will go down, but we won't be sure it's the result of solar flares or enemy action. What do you do? What do you do to maintain your electromagnetic capability to operate relative to adversaries who are trying to shut it down? You have a big advantage if you can do that. What do you do to shut down their systems? In other words, the management of information and information systems becomes at least as important as maneuver and firepower. Sir?
I have a question. You talked about being easier to basically hide things on land, where it's easier to find things in air and in the sea. What about in space?
Things are uncomfortably easy to find in space. Orbital mechanics is orbital mechanics. It's subject to the availability of reaction mass. And reaction mass under current technologies is kind of expensive to put up in orbit. So you can maneuver. So what can you do if you don't want to abandon space? You adopt the principle of ambiguity. What is the X-37B doing? If you knew, you wouldn't tell me. What is the impact on the adversary? Well, at the unclassified level, that the Chinese can't talk about anything else. So we're getting their attention. We're utilizing space. We're not presenting a clear military target. If it's, if it's an R&D test bed, why is it a legitimate target? But we are shifting enemy behavior in ways which are complicated. Let me just say that. Maybe to our advantage. There are other ways of making space platforms ambiguous. And if you knew about them, you wouldn't tell me about them. Right? Dark satellites, dual purpose satellites, all kinds of, yeah. Once you start thinking about this, you go, okay. So you don't have to abandon space, you just have to think about maintaining information dominance in space as importantly as you think about cost of pounds of payload to low Earth orbit.
So we've talked about how technology diffusion erases a certain dominance that the United States has enjoyed for the majority of the 20th century. Do you think that puts an impetus on us to act before we lose that dominance? I know you mentioned North Korea, but are there other situations in which we should act before diffusion takes away what advantage we have?
Setting aside the morality of preventive wars, you raised the issue of morality before, so yeah, I realize this is an issue. But setting that aside, I think the train has left the station on that. The number of scientists and engineers worldwide who are close to being equal to US, European, Japanese technology is in the thousands. If you it's the same thing. If you blow up an adversary's nuclear reactor, he's going to build another one. If you blow up some guy's arsenal of digital and information technology empowered RPVs, remotely piloted vehicles, he'll build more. You blow up his factories, he'll build more. Where are the Iranians building a ballistic missile factory underground now? In Syria? They're doing this because they have the technology people who know how to do this. And by putting it in Syria, you create some additional complicating issues with regard. That train left the station. Back in the early 1990s, right after the first Gulf War, there were some discussions in limited circles in the American government. Maybe the United States should develop a strategy right in the 1990s to lock in its position of superiority by friendly and unfriendly means. The unfriendly means are blowing up people. The friendly means were by offering American information technologies, products, and services at a below market price, to use market techniques to create and maintain a monopoly on this stuff. It's an interesting idea. I don't know if it would work, but nobody was interested. I am old enough to remember, you're a bit too young to remember, that was the period of time, the 1990s, when the United States decided it could take a vacation from history. My friends were writing books about the end of history and stuff like that and other nonsense. So there was not a demand signal at that time, and now it's too late, roughly.
All right, we have time for one more question, I think.
Can you say something more about military innovation? Because, I don't know, I've just read a book about these two Israelis about how technology innovation in there is really booming because you have a flat organizationally culture there within its military, but you also don't have a civ mil gap. Mm-hmm. The civ is the mil and effective because everyone serves. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the impediments here to military innovation based on both the organizational model as you see it, but also the civ mil model.
On the civilian military aspect of military innovation, in earlier talks to a classroom audience, I said my work on innovation focused on the United States and Great Britain, and I never claimed to be able to predict or explain innovation in other cases, because civilian-military relations in other countries differ radically from that in the United States. The example I gave was Stalin. If you can execute 90% of your division-level commanders, you can conduct military innovation in a way that's different from the way in which you conduct it in the United States. But it's irrelevant to us because we're not Stalin, we're not going to be Stalin, and we're not going to be Israel, although we came closer to having the kind of civilian-military relationship in World War II and immediately thereafter, because after a mass conscription war, you had lots and lots of people who were back in the civilian sector, but bought into the national security project. So short of something like World War II reoccurring to socialize a new generation of scientists, it almost happened after 9/11. I knew a lot of American scientists who otherwise would never go near the Defense Department doing some very interesting work, which actually was useful. But some sort of external shock like that would be necessary to recreate, in part, the easy flow of information in both directions. It would also have to break down American antitrust laws, it would also have to break down defense contracting laws. You would have to have defense officials and military officers actively supporting and collaborating with defense corporations. We're going to help you do your job. Yeah, you're going to make money. We're going to give you private internal U.S. government information because you need it to build the systems you need quickly. The Israelis do that. You don't do that. Okay? You could do it. Are we well set up to conduct military innovation? My belief is we have the problems that are the result of inheriting Cold War technology development establishments, which were big, capital-intensive organizations, which meant, or people thought that they meant, you could only make a few number of selective bets on technologies because systems cost intensive, but you can only buy one B2, you can only buy one B21. So you had to have a centralized system for allocating big chunks of resources. We can move away from that. I think we should have moved away from that. More to a DARPA model, more to a model, I wrote about this in my book, like we had in the late 40s and 50s. Build lots and lots of different kinds of systems in small numbers because we don't know what's going to be producible, what it's going to cost, whether it's going to work, whether or not it can be given to operational forces so they can work out concepts of operations because they can actually put these things in the hands of operating units. Yeah, we would have to shift up. And to a limited extent, we're doing that. The whole Rapid Capabilities Office initiative that started in the Air Force is now spread it's in the Army too. And then let's build a few of these things quickly. What's the mantra? It's not what can I build you, how much will it cost, and how much time do I have, how much time will it take. Here's how much money I have, here's how much time I have, what can you build? The whole paradigm flips. And people are starting to do that. I'm just arguing we should pick up the pace.
All right, with that, thank you very much, Dr. Rosen, for coming to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.